All right, welcome to week 7 forum. This week we are studying the impact of ideology as a motivation for terrorism. I would hasten to say that ideology, generically speaking, is not so much the problem. Ideology doesn't cause terrorism in that sense. In my introduction to political ideas class, I liken ideology to alcohol. Some people can handle it and use it appropriately, and some people just can't use it responsibly, and it contributes to them doing really stupid things. The chapter opens up with a discussion of skinhead culture, which initially emerged as a violent counterculture in the early 1970s out of working class sectors of the United Kingdom. What were some of the conditions in the United Kingdom that contributed to the formation of this culture in this particular period? How are skinheads in the UK distinct from German skinheads? What about American skinheads? What about those three kind of distinct groups that kind of plays up and contributes to their formation and their persistence? The role that race plays in skinhead culture to me is striking. Does one have to be a racist to be a skinhead? Or is racism unique to a particular subset of the broader skinhead culture? Is there a clear ideology to be discerned from skinhead music or literature? If so, would you characterize it as left or right in orientation? Are skinheads actually pushing a particular ideological platform, or are they just nihilist dickheads with a drinking problem that like to fight? If any of you have done any study in this particular group, I'd welcome your insights. Um, Martin spends some time providing an explanation of ideology, which I appreciate because a lot of people don't fully understand the role that ideology plays. Ideology is a word people use without fully comprehending what it is or the role it plays in shaping our understanding of politics. In the class I mentioned above, I follow Terry Ball and Richard Dagger's approach to understanding ideology, and note that they have, ideologies really have four typical functions. They explain the world. They provide an evaluation of the world. They orient people towards other groups of people, and they provide a program of action. And we can talk about that and how that works and how to differentiate an ideology from other types of phenomena that that motivate people, like nationalism or anarchism, which I'll talk about in a minute. Um, Martin also describes the origins of the left, center, right kind of orientation to ideologies, noting the advocacy of change or favoring the status quo, the left being, people that want change, the right being people that don't want change. That actually originated in where the delegates in the Estates General sat during in the early days of the French Revolution. It's actually similar to the fact that today we associate the Democrats with blue and Republicans with the color red. That really actually emerged during the 2000 elections. Prior to that, the color red had typically been associated with a more liberal progressive party. So ideology, like religion, provides deep well springs that people can draw upon to justify a lot of different things, including violence. Like religion, ideology inspires belief, and people willing to kill for a political cause are usually doing it out of deep-seated convictions that they're in the right. Take a look at Martin's analysis of ideology from the left to the right fringes on pages 158 to 160. Compare left, far left to far right ideological convictions, and then compare the fringe left and the fringe right ideological beliefs. What you're really going to see is a lot of mirror imaging going on and people believing sort of just the direct opposite of other people. I mentioned in my overview that I generally don't view anarchism as a standalone ideology, but rather acts as a sort of moderator of ideologies like socialism or liberalism. There were interpretations of socialism that were essentially anarchist in nature, that were advanced by people like Pierre Proudhon and Sergei Nechayev and Mikhail Bakunin, who were contemporaries and rivals of Karl Marx, just as there are libertarians who fit rather uncomfortably within the liberal camp, many of whom are essentially anarchists when they're being honest about their beliefs. I understand why Martin made the decision to characterize anarchism as a distinct ideology, because a huge wave of anarchist-inspired terrorism took place in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this was a logical place to mention the ideological motivations for that wave of violence, which is, in many ways, a lot of people that study terrorism consider this to be a kind of a distinctive period. David C. Rappaport argues that there tend to be distinctive waves of terrorism that take place kind of on a generational basis. Most of these assassinations, which took place throughout Europe and the United States in this period, and of course, two U.S. presidents, McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, were actually shot by anarchists, and they were undertaken by socialist anarchists. So, what were the motivations of these guys? How were they distinct from, for example, the garden variety Marxists? I mentioned, I think, in the overview that Marx, frankly, disagreed with these folks on their belief that assassinating people was going to work. Why did they believe that assassinating political figures was somehow a silver bullet that would bring about some, end of governance? Also, what contribution did Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels make to the ideological justifications for left terrorism? Marx himself, as I said, was contemptuous of many of his contemporary anarchist socialist rivals. Was Marx actually squeamish about the use of violence? What arguments did future Marxists make that echoed Marx's belief regarding the necessity of revolutionary means to overthrow capitalism and replace it, with a socialist system? How did that, in many instances, that became a justification for terrorism, especially in the 1960s. Just as extremists on the right are motivated by belief, just as extremists on the left are motivated by beliefs, so too are extremists on the right. To a large extent, far and fringe right, thinkers reflect a mirror image of far and fringe left ideologies, where the left rejects religion, ethnic loyalties, or nationalism as bases for understanding politics. The far and fringe right fetishize them. Most ideologies of the far right argue for radically particularistic understandings of politics. There are no universals. Human beings are not rational. They're not even reasonable. Politics operates for the far and fringe right at a primal level. That provides an explanation for why the far and fringe right draw, not so much on voluminous writings like the far left. The far left has a huge compendium of justifications for violence. The right, a lot of fascist writing boils down to Mussolini's dictum: don't think, fight. Right? Leftist groups have tended to engage in terrorist campaigns. They tend to draw heavily on Marxist theory and on the anti-colonialist literature that emerged after World War II. There was a significant amount of leftist terrorist activity in Latin and Central America in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and then a similar surge of leftist terrorist group organization and violence that ripped through Europe in a similar time frame. And of course, the text, I think, does a good job of listing those groups. In several instances, these terrorist groups were inspired by particular events, which we might, characterize as a demonstration effect. What literature did these groups draw on? Which of these groups do you find particularly interesting, or whose actions you were particularly appalled by? When you look at the section on right-wing activism and extremism, where have right-wing terrorist organizations emerged? What are the concerns that drive those organizations? To what extent did the activity of left-wing terrorist organizations spark the organization of right-wing terrorism in those countries? What are the typical motivations of these groups? What are the key characteristics of most of these groups? In a lot of instances, there's a great deal of interaction going on. There's a lot to discuss in this chapter. Much of the latter part of the chapter deals with speculations regarding the influence of ideology on the new terrorism that Martin discusses in earlier chapters, as well as forecasting the likelihood of future eruptions of left-wing and right-wing violence. Hopefully I've given you sufficient guidance and some questions for you to think about and talk about this week. As always, if something that I've said or something in the chapter confuses you, ask a question. and I'll get to it as soon as I can, if I can. Let's have a great week of discussion.